Welcome, everybody, to the Flying Dutchman podcast episode. And we have John Schaffer with us. And John has a interesting aviation career. He joined the Air Force. And John, you were the first class for the Air Force Academy?
I
Is that where it
was.
started?
I was in the very first class. I was appointed to that class by President Eisenhower, and we started out at Lowry Air Force Base in temporary quarters. They were actually old World War II wooden barracks that had been converted to two-man rooms, and that turned out to be the dormitory, so to speak, of the Air Force Academy. We were up there at Lowry Air Force Base in the temporary quarters.
Was that Colorado where that was at?
In Denver,
Denver.
Colorado.
Okay.
Yeah. And we were there for 3 years before they completed the construction of the permanent site down in Colorado Springs. So our allegiance and our ties to the Air Force Academy are deeply embedded in Denver and not Colorado Springs.
Ooh. Now, you probably felt like you were moving into the deluxe apartment in the sky when you went from them old barracks to the academy.
Yeah.
For your was it your final year of the academy that you got?
Final 9 months, the academic portion of my final year was spent down at the permanent site. And the permanent site did not have the chapel. The chapel was not started yet.
Oh.
And but it certainly had marching fields and athletic fields and things of that nature. The academic complex was all complete, of course, in the dining room, the chow hall, and the dormitory area. That was all complete. But the problem is we were not allowed to have automobiles until we were within 3 months of our graduation time. And most of us had cars up at Denver that we could hide in the adjoining city and park them on the street and walk through the gates. Here we are, we're back on board, we're back on site. But down at the permanent site in Colorado Springs, they had a 65-acre parking lot, and there better not be one damn car in that parking lot. So we weren't too thrilled about moving down to that particular site, but we did. One of the interesting features being in the first class, I thought perhaps it would be something like West Point, big stone buildings with ivy covered over the stone, nice, beautiful shade trees. But instead, they introduced us to those World War II wooden barracks, and the trees turned out to be saplings, one sapling between each dormitory. So it's pretty sparse compared to what I had envisioned.
Very sparse.
It didn't take long to get over it. Being in the first class, when you say you were in the very first class of a major service academy, most people think, well, you were very lucky because you had no upperclassmen to haze you, to race you through the drills and all of that paraphernalia. They hazed you. And what they didn't realize is the academy saw fit to bring in approximately 300 upperclassmen who happened to be brand new graduates out of the pilot training program. Most of them were graduates themselves of either West Point or Annapolis. And those guys were called air training officers. They moved into the barracks with us, and they had one job only. That was to harass us for the entire year. They didn't have to keep up their own academic records. They didn't have to keep up their own military stance. So they were unusual upperclassmen. They stayed with us for the first 2 years. Then after that, we took over as upperclassmen and got to harass the other guys.
But you learned from them too, didn't
you? We did learn from them. And for the first 2 years, we hated their guts. But I'll tell you what, the minute we stepped into the Air Force uniform, we realized that those guys really did us a favor. And we turned out to love every one of those air training officers. They were magnificent, magnificent. They harassed the daylights out of us, but they did it for a cause. So
Oh yeah.
we owe those fellas a big round of applause for what they did for the classes at the Air Force Academy, particularly the first two classes.
How did you come to want to be in the Air Force? What to be a pilot? Was that your goal?
To be a pilot specifically. I was born in 1937. So the war broke out, in 41, Second World War. And by the time it was over, I was probably 8 years old, but I saw all of these movies about the Air Force. And also there was newscasts, black and white newscasts coming from overseas that showed the bombers taking off in England and some shots of the fighter jets. So I think, looking back, that was probably the beginning of my motivation to become a pilot, because, of course, they were saving the world. They were keeping moms and daughters and wives safe. And I thought that was a remarkable goal for those young guys. But and of course, my father was in the Air Force at the time. Actually, it was the Army Air Force. And so he was there was a lot of hero worship going on between myself and my father. So that's what I decided would be a really nice route to follow. So that's probably where the initial motivation came from, the war films and footage of the Second World War. And of course, I went through teenage years of building model airplanes, gas-powered, radio-controlled, and control line airplanes.
Oh, yeah, the U-controls.
Yeah. They made you somewhat dizzy going around a line in a circle at a high rate of speed. Yeah. But, I got a lot of enjoyment out of that. My income was very limited, my education even more limited, and my chances of getting into pilot training seemed very remote indeed. And of course, as I expressed before, my father had been killed in an aircraft accident. He was a flight engineer on a B-29. And when his plane crashed, then it opened up an avenue for me to get into the service academies. And at that point, there were only two, the Navy and the Army, West Point and Annapolis. So I was planning to go to one of those two if I could. I had joined the Civil Air Patrol at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base when I was a junior in high school. And so I had a lot of knowledge about airplanes and flying, and we were very fortunate in as much as we had access to a lot of training devices that the average guy probably would never see. For example, we had cutaways of actual axial flow jet engines and mock-ups for flight controls on fighter airplanes. So it was quite an orientation basis for me to be prepared to go into the Air Force. And my senior year in high school, at one of the Civil Air Patrol meetings, a friend of mine came racing through the door and said, "Schaffer, don't go to West Point, don't go to Annapolis. Why don't you go to the Air Force Academy?" I said, "Great, that would be wonderful if they had an Air Force Academy. I'd try to go there." Well, he said, "They just started one. They're taking applications this month." That was November of 1954. And so I filled the paperwork and the application and submitted it. And long story short, I made it into the first class of the Air Force Academy.
Oh, that's excellent.
And it wasn't, the dream of mine was to go through pilot training, Air Force military pilot training. And the odd thing about graduates from the Air Force Academy they made you go to pilot training. You had no choice. So I thought,
Wow.
what a deal.
Yeah.
That would be incredible. So that's how I ended up at the Air Force Academy.
I know at the current Air Force Academy, they have gliders and they have
Yes, they
access
do.
to aircraft. Did
Yes.
they have anything like that introducing you guys to flight?
No, they did not. Did not. We were up at Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, and the upperclassmen there, training officers who were multi-engine qualified, flew B-25s out of Lowry Air Force Base. They had to get their flight time each month. And those that were jet qualified flew out of Buckley Naval Air Station. But they were off limits to cadets. We couldn't fly those, obviously. But they did have an orientation flight in the backseat of a T-33 training jet.
Ooh.
Yeah. And
that would be fun.
Yeah, that was fun. But as I explained to you before, these air training officers, they were kind of ornery sometimes. And for their orientation flight, they had a contest going on to see how quickly they could get the poor cadet in the backseat to throw up. So our rides were rather brutal, but they were a lot of fun. And they would take us down out of Buckley Naval Air Station and fly us down to where the academy was being built. And we'd run gunnery attacks on the building site. And that was quite spectacular. It was a motivating flight. Whether you got sick or not didn't make any difference. You were in the back of a jet airplane.
If you got sick, you had to clean it up too.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure. Yeah. Fortunately, I made it through. I had a sack ready, but I didn't have to use it. Yeah.
Oh, good for you. I want to back up. And your father was killed. He's flight engineer on a B-29.
Yes.
Did they fly out of Wright-Patterson?
He was flying out of Republic Factory on Long Island.
Okay.
They were using B-29s and Republic F-84, the straight wing F-84 model. There were two significant versions of the F-84. One was swept wing, one was straight. So they were using hookup between the straight wing 84 and the wingtip of the B-29. And unfortunately, the experiment didn't go too well on one particular flight, and it ended up disabling the B-29. The fighter pilot had actually hooked up wingtip to wingtip with the B-29. And in theory, it was going to be a long flight where the B-29 would drag that fighter to the target area, wherever that happened to be. The fighter would start its engines, release from the bomber, provide fighter protection and coverage over the target area. And hopefully they would be able to survive the attack and hook back up, and the B-29 would haul them back to their home base, wherever that happened to be. So in the fatal accident, they had hooked up, and the fighter pilot was ready to turn on his autopilot. And the autopilot, it was hoped, would relieve the fatigue that fighter pilots would feel shortly after hooking up on the wingtip of a wing that's going up and down and forward and backward to some extent. And when that electrical contact was made, the F-84 did an immediate roll, and it ripped or knocked the wing off the B-29. So with the loss of one wing, the B-29, of course, was in a very abrupt spin, and centrifugal force kept everybody from getting out, exiting that airplane. And that's the one my father was on. In addition to that, the F-84 pilot, his plane was still relatively intact and certainly was flyable, but he kept going down because the Russians had trawlers outside Long Island Sound, at least out as far as to international waters. And they were recording conversations and they were taking videos of the planes. And supposedly the hookup mechanism was, of course, top secret at the time. And they didn't want the trawlers coming in and picking up any pieces of the wreckage. So the fighter pilot stayed with his airplane to impact so that our radar people could get an exact location of where they were going down. So it was quite a deal. I was 15 at the time and had three younger brothers, and my fourth brother was due to be born 2 months later. So,
oh my.
Yeah.
And thus you became the man of the house.
Very fast. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I believe this particular accident too was covered in Colonel Bud Anderson's book.
Yeah, incredible. But you were at a show or a conference where Bud Anderson was there as a speaker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was promoting his book and signing his book. So it was at the California Capitol Air Show where
happened to be working at Sacramento, and he knew of my father's involvement in that particular incident. So he went apparently to the same briefing by Colonel Anderson. Mm-hmm. And he talked to him after the meeting, apparently the same way you did. And Bud Anderson autographed a book and gave it to my friend, who in turn gave it to me. So
that's very cool.
An autographed book by Bud Anderson on that particular thing. But it is a fascinating read, and it gives great detail about that project. And that was nicknamed Tiptoe.
Tiptoe.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good.
That is very good. So here we are graduating from the academy, and you're guaranteed to go to pilot training.
Must go. No choice.
Must go. I hope everybody wanted to be pilots in that graduating class.
Oh, you betcha.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know how many people graduated?
Well, we graduated. We started out with 306. And we graduated 206, and we commissioned 205. So we lost one fellow who developed, I forgot now the name of the problem, but he went into convulsions automatically without control. Epilepsy, I'm sorry. That's the word I'm looking for. In his junior year at the academy. And they gave that fellow the choice. You could continue and get the degree, but you won't be commissioned for medical reasons. And he elected to continue. So he graduated with us with full graduating honors, but he was not commissioned as a second lieutenant. So
where did they send you for pilot training?
That's another funny story. They sent me down to Mission, Texas, which is within walking distance of the current Eagle Pass checkpoint where all the immigrants are coming across the border. So it was called Moore Air Base. And at the time, the Air Force had contracted to civilian companies to provide instructors, pilot instructors for Air Force officers. So this was a leftover World War II air base where they did training. Then the military turned over the training to civilian contractors. So for that particular stint, that was done I flew T-34s, was the first airplane I soloed in, and then moved on to the T-28. Both of those were done at Moore Air Base in Mission, Texas. Then from there, I went to Alabama, lived about 3 blocks from the famous bridge that Martin Luther King marched across a few years after I graduated from there. But at any rate, at Craig Air Force Base in Selma, Alabama, I flew T-33s. and finally gained my Air Force pilot wings at Selma.
Wow. But the T-34 Mentor and then the T-28 Trojan, the T-20 is quite bigger. So it's a larger aircraft than the T-34, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a brute of an airplane. It's huge. It was quite impressive. Somewhat intimidating to go from the T-34 to the T-28, but the plane was designed to behave and provide feelback to the pilot that would mimic what the T-33 would do. So
okay.
prepping airplane, if you will, for entry into the T-33. And that did a magnificent job. The T-33, you felt if you shut your eyes, you could barely tell the difference between a T-33 flight characteristics and the T-28. And they certainly didn't look the same.
No, they did. And the T-33, that's a gorgeous looking airplane.
Yeah, it's a nice airplane.
Do you remember how many hours you accumulated in the
I think we accumulated a grand total of probably 50 hours in the T-33. Yeah.
Wow.
An equal amount, probably, in the other.
And then you did a solo in the T-33.
I did solo in the T-33, yeah. Soloed in each one.
Okay.
Solo. So,
and did you do a cross country in the T-33?
We did cross countries in the T-28 and the T-33.
Do you remember where you went?
No. No.
This is the time when you want to make something up and lie to me, because I'm a very gullible host.
Yeah. That would be a great opportunity.
But this is a question that I do have. As I understand it, the Air Force, we'll just say the Air Force right now, it's graduation night, and they have a party, and they really make an event of it. And the individual is called, they walk up, and then they learn the airframe they're going to train on. And how you scored determines what slots are going to be available to you. If you're a high performer, and maybe you could get the F-35, F-22, something like that. If you're not a high performer, or if your dream sheet, you would rather fly C-130s because that's what you want. You want to fly the Hercules. How was it done when you graduate from pilot training?
That was done exactly the same way. It depended on your class standing. So at graduation, the training squadron would be given a list of airplane openings, vacancies that they wish to fill. And
a lot more options back then.
There were options.
A lot of different airframes.
A lot of different airplanes and advanced training. You could go to helicopters after graduating with your pilot wings. And we had a couple of fellows that did that. But the way it went is the guy that was number one class standing in the class got his choice of all the airplanes that were made available. And invariably, the top 10 or 15 guys would go to jet fighters if they could. And then as it came on down the line, the planes became more varied. Like you say, C-130s were available. You could go to helicopter training. You could go to B-47s. You could go to KC-97s. And over the years, I spent at the academy, I became enchanted with the dropping of the atom bombs in Japan and the termination of the Second World War. And so I was primed and ready to go to Strategic Air Command and fly bombers. Well, the only bomber that was available to me was a B-47, and the B-47 was killing new pilots right and left. If you look, you're familiar with the B-47.
I am.
It has the outboard engine is really out towards the tip of the wing. And if you had on a takeoff roll, if that outboard engine failed, it would immediately put enough rotational stress on the airplane that you couldn't control it. You couldn't even pull down the throttle on the opposite engine to maintain straight and level flight. And so it was developing quite a record of crashing and killing the student pilots. And I said, well, I do want to go to SAC, but I don't want to go that B-47. So I'll take a KC-97. At least it will get me into SAC and perhaps open up a doorway to get into bombers, the B-52 specifically.
And, what year is this?
1961.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they were still producing the B-52s up until 63, I think. I'm not sure.
I think it was, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That was you wanted the B-52. So you got the KC-97.
I did. I got the KC-97, moved up to Great Falls, Montana. That was the first duty assignment in the Air Force.
Is that where they trained you to fly it?
No. The advanced training took place at Randolph Air Force Base, San Antonio, Texas. And that's where all of the KC-97 training took place at that time. I don't know where it was before or after, but at the time that I was coming through the pipeline, that's where it was. So we spent, I suspect the time frame was probably 3 months in the KC-97 training squadron, and then moved on up to the operational assignment at Great Falls, Montana, Moundston Air Force Base. Yeah.
Then I've been at Castle Air Museum. They have one there, and during open cockpit day, you can access it.
Yeah.
That looks like a very busy cockpit.
That's
a very busy flight engineer station.
Flight engineer was very busy on that plane also. Yeah.
But it at the same time, it's roomy. You probably had nice hot box lunches to bring with you.
Well, we had box lunches. I wouldn't say they were hot, but cold and dry sandwiches by the time I got to them. Yeah.
But quite a view. I mean, the cockpit.
That was the most magnificent view of any airplane I've flown.
Yeah, I could
glass
say
all around.
Oh, you could probably grow tomatoes in that greenhouse.
Yeah. But so you're a very comfortable airplane to fly. And the refueling mission to me was somewhat boring. You had to fly straight and level for the hookup, and you couldn't even see the plane that was hooked up.
Can you feel the effects of the receiver aircraft on your controls, or was there any, or was nothing was going to push a KC-97 around?
Well, the impact on the controls was very minimal. I think because of the proficiency of the pilot in the KC-97 keeping it straight and level, and the B-47 or even the B-52s would come in, and we could refuel either one of those.
I've seen where the KC-97, it would actually, you guys would have to do like a toboggan maneuver for airspeed. A toboggan where you would have to go in a shallow dive.
We did. A shallow descent if we were refueling B-47s. The B-47 couldn't fly slow enough to hook onto the boom of the KC-97. So to compensate for that, the 97 would go into a shallow dive and build up airspeed. And of course, we had our engines up at, I don't remember the power setting, but they were a higher power setting. And at that airspeed, then we could hook up, the B-47 could slow down safely to hook onto the boom. And
how long would they hang on the boom in a shallow descent?
How could they?
How long did it take to pass gas in a shallow descent? I don't know what altitude you started, but
yeah, probably descending to about 500 feet per minute. And and our refueling block was a three-dimensional piece of airspace. We had vertical allowance in that airspace to descend as required, as needed to get the fuel offloaded.
Okay. And here's the other is I've seen video of a KC-97 because the KC-97 eventually, the G's or L model, they got the jet pods
Jet pods.
that help.
Yes. Yeah.
And but I've seen video of a B-52 with its gears extended being refueled from a KC-97.
Okay. I think
And then I've seen
that
it
might have
where they
been.
didn't. I don't know if I find that, maybe it's because it didn't have jet pods at the time. I don't know, but why would a B-52 have his landing gears hanging while refueling?
I think I've seen a picture of a B-47 with his gear out.
Mm-hmm.
And I never realized that before, never saw it before. But the only thing I can think of is that could operate as a means of drag, additional drag on the B-47, which would allow the B-47 then to keep its engines up at a higher power setting so that they could break away from the tanker if need be.
Okay.
Because bringing the gear up, those engines were pretty slow to gear up, and certainly from idle. So you didn't want your refueler to be back at idle in case you had a disconnect or some kind of an emergency that they needed to separate in flight. And so to keep that power up would have been a good thing to do.
Yeah, and it looks like it's easy when you don't have accidents and you see it, and for people that follow airplanes, but there have been incidences of collisions between refuelers and receiver aircraft.
There are, yeah.
And how long did you fly the KC-97?
For year-wise, about 18 months, about a year.
And
there, shortly after arriving at Malmstrom Air Force Base at my first actual air refueling mission, I decided that this was a pretty boring way to spend my life. I needed just a tad more excitement.
What did you do?
Well, at that point, I volunteered to transfer to B-52s. I became an immediate celebratory. Nobody ever volunteered to go to B-52s.
Do we know why they didn't volunteer?
The best thing I can say is because of General Curtis LeMay. He ran a tight ship. And once you got sucked into Strategic Air Command, it was very difficult to get out because
they were their own mafia.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Well, and you went from the KC-97. Now you've got the slot for a B-52. Where did they send you to learn how to fly the B-52?
Okay, all B-52 training was conducted at Castle Air Force Base.
Oh, very cool.
All of it. Yeah. So for years and years, they trained B-52 pilots down there at Castle, along with KC-135 pilots. They were down there also. So Castle Air Force Base was an activity of aeronautical hub. There were flying down there 24/7. It was quite a place. And to go back to Castle Air Force Base today and visit the museum is kind of a disheartening thing, because you see the grass growing up on the cracks in the runways, and all of the buildings, except for the training and the hangars, they've been torn down and replaced. And it's now turned into it's an actual growing commercial aviation spot.
It is.
Which is fine. It's no problem. But it's sad to see a once thriving military base.
I was lucky enough to get down there in the early 90s for air shows.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And now it's an air park, which slowly is becoming quite successful. And the Castle Air Museum is one of my favorites. It's a really good museum.
Yes, they have an incredible number of airplanes there.
Over 70, I believe.
I never counted. I've been down there a couple of times myself. And it's a real tragedy that they're all exposed to the California sunshine.
They have
daylights out of those airplanes on display.
They do, and the a lot of museums are in good locations where there's a lot of money, where it's the Intrepid Museum or the USS Midway or the
Yeah.
Navy Museum, but they're in the San Joaquin Valley where you don't have a high economic, but they do so well with what they got. And I know they have funding going where they're going to be building a indoor exhibit where they can put some of those aircraft inside, including
Good.
that B-20. Yeah, so they're
Perfect.
yeah, for where they're at, they do well. But yeah, the California sun and the dust, the
Yeah.
wind, it does take a toll
Yeah.
on them.
Yeah.
So how long was your B-52 training?
B-52 training took 6 months. It
Ah,
was interrupted halfway through by the Cuban Missile Crisis.
oh, that thing.
So they shut down the school immediately
Mm-hmm.
and tried to disperse the students depending on their status within the school training syllabus. If you were more than halfway through, they wanted you to go on to your new assignment, even though you weren't qualified to fly that new airplane. And if you were in less than 6 months, they wanted you to go back to your previous assignment, which in my case would have been KC-97s or Great
Mm-hmm.
Falls, Montana.
Mm-hmm.
I felt very fortunate in being allowed to transfer out of that in the first place. And I was terrified, frankly, that if I ever went back to KC-97s, I'd be stuck there for the rest of my career.
Terrified.
And my assignment was to Dow Air Force Base. I'm sorry, Loring Air Force Base, or was it Dow? Dow Air Base in Maine. And a friend of mine, his father had been the adjutant general at Malmstrom Air Force Base during the Second World War. And he was overseeing the transfer of, I think, was P-39 aircraft into Russia under
Oh
the
yeah, the
under the
Lend-Lease Act. Yeah.
Lend-Lease program.
Yeah.
So he happened to be back in Great Falls, Montana, shortly before I was to leave to get B-52 training. And he wanted to know where I was going. And I told him, well, I'm going to the state of Maine. And he said, for God's sake, why are you going up there? Why don't you come to Wright Pat? We've got B-52s right there at Wright Pat. And I said, well, Colonel, you don't understand. Second lieutenants and first lieutenants just don't have that much of power.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, well, let me see what I can do. So, son of a gun, before I left to go to Castle, I had my orders were changed as per a telegram from Dow Air Base in Maine to Wright-Patterson. And when I was down at Castle during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were asking everybody to come up front one at a time and explain where you were in the training syllabus. And when I told the lieutenant or the captain in charge, I said, well, sir, I've got orders to go to
Right,
is
Pat.
it Loring Air Force Base or Dow? I can't remember which.
Yeah.
I said, I got orders to go to Dow Air Force Base in Maine, but they've been changed. And he said, well, what did your order change? And I said, well, sir, I don't have official orders, but I got this telegram from a colonel at Wright-Patterson that said I'm scheduled now to go to Wright-Pat. And he said, we dickered back and forth, and he said, are you still qualified on the KC-97? I said, yes, sir, I am. He said, well, why don't you go back there like you're supposed to? And I explained, if I go back there, I'm never going to make it to B-52s, and I can make the greatest contribution to the Air Force in the B-52. And I said, well, sir, I'd like to go to Wright-Pat and fly B-52s. So that's how I got to Wright-Pat in the B-52.
Ooh, that was a near miss.
Yeah, it was a miracle.
Yeah.
A miracle. Yeah.
When you were training on the B-52, you have to learn how to refuel. So now you're on the receiving end.
Yes. Yeah.
And since you had KC-135s sharing the ramp at Castle, was that who you were training to take fuel from? Was KC-135s?
No, 135s.
Did you ever have to try and get fuel from a KC-97?
No, never did.
No, I didn't have to look at that.
No.
What was it like trying to, for the first time, sitting in the seat with an instructor and then another student behind you, right? You
Yeah,
guys would change
yeah,
seats to learn how to top.
yeah.
That had to have been a chore to try and get a
That was
52.
quite a shuffle. The first student would get up there making his attempt to hook up to the boom 10135 would have that airplane sashaying back and forth from right to left, and unfortunately going up and down at the same time. And they would create a breakaway maneuver command where the bomber immediately separated back and backed away from the tanker. So they would get about 5 or 6 breakaways, and then he'd kick that student out of the seat and bring the next one in, who was laughing uproariously at what his fellow student had been doing, and strap in, and they'd turn the aircraft over to him and say, "Okay, son, go right in there and pick up the gas." And he immediately started oscillating back and forth and up and down. And now the previous student is the one who can sit in the back and observe this without any obligations at all, except to sit there and laugh.
Oh, that's
Laugh
funny.
until you cry. If it wasn't so damn close to the other airplane, it wouldn't really be funny. But
No, and it's quite close to the, and
yeah,
you're traveling.
it's close.
I'm not sure what airspeed you're doing when you're refueling like this.
We're probably doing, I'd say, probably around 300
That's
knots. But they're both doing the same airspeed, so you get no impression at all that you're flying fast. You just have to be close to that airplane. So
sometimes receiver aircraft complain that the tanker drags them through the clouds when they're not necessary. But so you've done your training. Now you're off to Ohio. And what do you remember the squadron that you were assigned to?
I do not. I know what this 42nd Bomb Wing, I think, was the wing.
And they were silver B-52s?
They were silver B-52s.
With white bellies?
Oh, they had white bellies. The B-52s that during the years that I was flying that, I flew an E model B-52, which had the original size engines, and it was dedicated to nuclear attack. And the underside of that airplane was painted white for reflecting the heat that would have been emitted by the fireball from the nuclear explosion. So that was the primary reason of the underside of the airplane, wingtip and airplane itself being painted white, was to reflect the heat.
And what year are we at now?
We're at 61, 62.
Oh, wow. Yeah. The height of the Cold War.
Yeah. Truly was.
So
that was very, very exciting period of time, too. The procedure was to go on ground alert for 7 days, 7 nights, and you would live in an underground facility, and your airplane was parked right outside the facility, the alert facility, fully loaded with 6 nuclear bombs and ready to go to war. And you get off 6 days, 7 days ground alert, and you would go home, and you got, 2 or 3 days off, and then you would go on airborne alert, which meant that you would then take off in a fully loaded B-52 with the 6 nukes on board and proceed to a couple of different areas. One was up the Mediterranean, and you'd fly up the Mediterranean until Russian radar picked you up on their screen. And the B-52 had skin sensors on there where you could see if the radar was actually painting your particular airplane. And when you picked up the Russian radar, then you would set up a racetrack pattern and just sit there and fly hour after hour, racetrack pattern, a couple of hours away from nuclear Russian targets. And they knew that we were watching them, and the Russians knew we were watching them, and it was kind of a Mexican standoff.
Yeah. How big of a track? How big of a track would that be?
I'm sorry.
How big of a racetrack pattern is
As I
measured in
recall,
miles?
it was probably 6-minute legs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
You
6 minutes
know your
do
target?
a 180 and 6 minutes the other way, and another 180 and 6 minutes.
Wow.
Just
What did you know what your targets would
oh
be
yeah,
if the code came through?
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah, you know what your targets were there, as well as when you were on ground alert. The
Okay.
first day of ground alert, you spent about 4 hours studying the targets that you would attack if war did break out.
Was this still a high altitude drop, or was this about the time that the B-52 was broaching the low altitude
It
delivery?
was both. We were doing both types at that point.
Hmm.
So some of our training missions would be high altitude releases, and other training missions would be assigned low altitude routes.
With the low altitude route, were those delivery would be by the bomb? Did they have parachutes or something to slow their descent
They
to
did
allow
have
you?
some. They had parachute drag chutes to slow them down and give us time to get away from the attack. Uh,
Mm.
your target was assigned a high release or low release,
Hmm.
depending on the type of explosion you were trying to deliver.
Right.
The explosion was classified as either a ground burst or an air burst.
Hmm.
A ground burst was defined as the actual fireball of the weapon touching the ground, touching the earth.
Hmm.
And of course, it vaporized everything on the ground and created quite an incredible nuclear reactive cloud, and where you had radioactive fallout that would
Hmm.
be around for quite some time and would spread, of course, with the air currents. Uh,
Hmm.
the air release was just the opposite. The fireball did not touch the ground, and so you had minimal fallout lingering after the attack.
Oh, okay. So there,
Yeah.
that would tell you what your targets were just based on the delivery
Yes. Yeah.
thing. Yeah. And the movie Doctor Strangelove. Are you familiar with that movie?
Absolutely. I think I saw it about 4 times. I
Uh,
saw it when it was setting on ground alert.
what was your impression of that movie?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was a great, great movie.
Did you have a Slim Pickens in that squadron of yours?
Well, we had a couple of slims.
Did you
We
now?
did. Yeah. But no, it was a very entertaining movie, and was based on everything that the B-52 was doing was highly classified.
Yes.
And so when the movie producers contacted the Air Force to get some technical advice in creating this movie, the Air
Hmm.
Force refused to do it. So where they got their information on the tactics of the B-52 is incredible. Should
The
not have been
part,
out, should not have been on the screen. And of course,
well,
most people think, well, that's all part of the imagination of the producer of the movie, but some of it was quite accurate.
the
Yeah,
code
yeah,
that they received in the aircraft and
yeah,
comparing that code and
yeah,
then pulling,
yeah,
yeah, that to me that looked pretty authentic.
yeah. It
And
was. It
but
was. Yeah.
it was, I don't know if a lot of people in the
Somebody
audience,
probably talked out a turn.
I think they probably
I think
did.
they probably did. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
did. And so now your obligation to the Air Force is coming to an end
It
while
did.
fighting 52s. And what year is this?
Okay. My obligation to the Air Force was 5 years from the end of pilot training. And I was approaching 8 years. I
Hmm.
passed my obligation and was now serving, and fully intended that I would spend the rest of my career in the Air Force, hopefully flying B-52s
Hmm.
and hopefully following the motto that peace is our profession. We,
Yeah.
during the time of our secret Cold War, Strategic Air Command did keep the world safe, no doubt about it.
No, there's no doubt
No
about
doubt
it.
about it.
Just having a number of fit, because you weren't the only
Oh
B-52
no.
near Russia.
And airborne alert. We had B-52s on the edge of radar, Russia's radar network 24/7,
Hmm.
365 days a year. There wasn't a single amount of time when we didn't have B-52 bombers ready to attack Russia and very close to their borders, for that matter. Yeah.
Do you find it impressive that the B-52s are still flying today?
Unheard of. Yes.
It would be like taking a Sopwith Camel to Desert Storm. You know,
Well,
and the
except it's
52
so lethal and so
and the
capable of doing its mission. Yeah.
oh yeah, and now it carries hypersonic
Yeah.
air
Yeah.
to surface, and
Yeah.
it's apparently it's going to be flying until they suggest 2040, 2050. It's
I've
getting
heard
new
that.
engine. It's getting
I've
those new
heard that.
Rolls-Royce
Yeah.
130 motors.
Yeah.
Great motors.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the last B-52 pilot has not been born yet. When you
That's
really
for
think
sure.
about it. Yeah.
That's for
Though
sure.
we're trying.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
But
so
it was a great airplane. Crosswind landing gear. It
oh
was,
yeah, the crab.
oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some
You could
yeah.
crab into the wind for crosswind landings.
Did you do that
Oh
more
yeah.
than once?
Oh yeah. Absolutely. It was a standard landing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was it tough landing the B-52?
I'm sorry.
Was it very difficult to land the B-52, or did
Not
it settle okay? Or
after you finally got used to landing, looking out the co-pilot's window as you're touching down on the runway, it became kind of second nature. But
that would be something.
yeah, when you had to crank those landing gear significantly off the center line, so the it's a difficult thing to describe, but the plane itself and the engines are facing into the wind, whichever direction it's coming from. But the wheels have to be lined up with the runway to allow you to hold that crab until you touch down. Normally, what you would have to do in a lighter, smaller airplane is hold that crab, and then prior to touchdown, you have to kick in rudder real hard and real fast to align with the runway. Otherwise, the impact of putting the weight of the airplane on landing gear that's crabbed sideways to the direction of movement would blow a couple of tires, or at the worst could tear that landing gear off. And B-52 being such a significantly heavy airplane, they had to figure out a way to keep that to a minimum. And the crosswind landing gear did it beautifully.
Yeah.
It did take some getting used to, because the natural urge for a pilot when you're just about to touch down is to align the airplane with the center line of the runway.
That's what you were trained to do.
Sideways. And so it's kind of challenging.
Yeah.
Fun. And engines out on one side, you had to practice proficiency once a year in cutting all four engines on one side and still being able to land the airplane.
Really? Wow.
That was quite a feat.
Yeah, that's definitely quite a feat.
It was. Yeah.
So you left the Air Force in 1967?
67, I did. I served 8 years in the Air Force, and in 1967, I decided that perhaps I would be more qualified to fly commercial. And well, let me back off. There was one thing I didn't want to do was to become a Greyhound bus driver in the sky. And I felt I owed a lot to the Air Force because they gave me this capability to fly big airplanes. So I was not going to fly for the airline, and my professional qualifications of dropping nuclear bombs didn't seem to have much of a civilian market.
They do now.
I decided that the best thing for me to do is to take my aeronautical engineering skills, and go to work for the company that made the B-52. So I applied for a job as an aeronautical engineer in Boeing. And in 1967, all the airplane manufacturers were hiring engineers like crazy and complying with contracts with the U.S. government. And the government, of course, was paying the companies depending on the number of engineers they had on their payroll. So to keep the income coming and to fatten it up just a little bit, they would hire anybody who had a degree in aeronautical engineering. I didn't have a major in engineering, but it was close to it. So they offered me a job immediately upon receipt of my transcript and said, yeah, come on up to Renton, Washington, and we'll put you to work as an aeronautical engineer. And I said, great. We described the pay scale and the potential of retirement, et cetera, et cetera. And they also included a brochure of their aeronautical engineering department, which turned out to be, it looked like a World War II aircraft hangar, about 12 acres of drafting tables in there.
Wow.
And gray-haired old men humped up on a stool with a T-square on a drawing board. And I thought,
didn't look appealing?
That didn't look too appealing. So I dropped that, and then I applied for General Dynamics. General Dynamics was looking for a test pilot for the F-111 program. And I said, oh, yeah, that's for me. I can be a test pilot. So I applied to General Dynamics. And just like Boeing, they hired me immediately. I didn't even have an interview with either one of these two companies. And
wow.
No, none whatsoever. But General Dynamics was very nice. They offered to bring myself and my wife down and put us up for 4 to 5 days. And they'd show us which country club we should join. And they'd show us where their engineers generally lived. And it sounded very good. So I went back to home base, and was contemplating, do I do this or not? So I called them up and just to get a feel for what the job was like. And they said, well, we'll put you in an orientation program. That'll take about 4 days. And then you're off to go. You'll be a test pilot on the F-111. I said, hold on. I've never been to test pilot school in the Air Force. I know nothing about the F-111. And I do know it's going to take longer than 4 or 5 days for me to train to take over an F-111. I said, take over the 111? Son, you're not going to fly the airplane. You're going to hook up all the computer recorders and make sure everything is being done. We have to have to test the results of the airplane. And I said, that really doesn't sound like the job I thought I was signing up for. I said, when can I fly the airplane? And they laughed and said, well, son, maybe in about 20 years, we'll move you into the flying test pilot job. And I said, I'm sorry, but I'm just not interested in that particular job. And he said, well, wait a minute. We build boats on the East Coast. I forgot the name. I said, you build boats? And they said, yes, we can use you in the boat building trade. And I said, no.
Oh.
So I fell back on my only qualifications, and that was an airline pilot. So I did so reluctantly. I went to United Airlines, and it turned out that was the wisest choice I ever could have made. Up until United Airlines went belly up. Now, I spent 28 years flying for United Airlines when they finally declared bankruptcy and all of our retirement benefits had been terminated. Our medical coverage had been terminated.
Oh, that is so bad.
There I sat. And there I said, I could have kicked myself right in the rear end. I could have stayed in the Air Force for this amount of time and had a really great retirement.
You could have been over North Vietnam in a B-52.
Or in Vietnam, yeah.
They
Yeah.
lost a few over there. But
Yes.
so,
Yeah.
what airframes did you fly while you flew for United?
Well, outside of the training airplane, I'm sorry, for United. I
Yeah.
started out on the Caravel and flew that for about 2 years. Then my seniority, two things happened. My seniority had risen to the point where I could bid on a different airplane, and the company got rid of the Caravel and replaced it with the 737.
Mm,
Yeah. So I
that's a good
started
airframe.
on the Caravel, and I flew the 727 then for 26 years. Stayed on
Wow.
the same airplane and enjoyed an immense
That's
senior.
a great airplane. The
Yeah,
727 was really great.
727 was a workhorse, very
Hmm.
versatile. Yeah, it was a great
Yeah.
airplane.
The early ones I remember at the Sacramento Executive Airport.
Yeah.
Actually, 727s actually came in and out of there for a while.
For the executive field?
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
and I remember my dad had to leave and go on a trip, and it was a 727 out of
Okay.
executive. Yeah,
I'll
but
be
they only ran it for a couple of years, but it was the earlier 727s.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's a great airframe.
Yeah.
And when you left United, you just retired from working, or did you do anything else? Or?
Oh, I retired.
Ah,
To that. Yeah.
smart man.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to thank you for being on the show.
You bet.
And maybe we'll run into each other at the museum someday.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look forward to it.
All right.
All right.
Well,
Thank you very much.
thank you. And we'll say goodbye to our audience.
All right.
And, yep. And we'll see you again.
Okay.
Bye
Thank
bye,
you.
John. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Good night. Lean to me, so show me where I can.